Okay, good evening, members. So this is the third of our session of Uma. So I don't now need to again introduce her. So Uma, I think we can start. We have got everybody. We sent them the mail, so everybody knows what you are going to start with. So you can straight away start with your session.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a joy to be doing this session every month. There was in my earlier days with the ICICI Prudential, I used to write a monthly newsletter, which used to go to all the advisors, all the bank adams, and everyone. And so I used to be all the time spending my time thinking about, Abhi, what is the new and nice thing that I should be putting today. Now, this session has become something like that, So it's always running at the back of my mind. Oh, this is an important nugget. I must talk about this. Or this is a nice, interesting piece of information. I should talk about this. So I think I must thank FIFA for providing me this opportunity where, I am able to interact with the advisor community in a structured manner. So thank you so much for this opportunity. um yeah, I always love to talk, so it's a it's beautiful. The only thing I miss is the interaction. I miss the energy I would draw from the participants. Typically, the enthusiasm. Somebody was telling me, Uma, you have your voice has become much softer, and you have become. I said, nothing, kuch nahi hua hai. The only thing is I'm not seeing the participants. So if you see the participants, you draw the energy from their interaction. I do miss that, but I think in these pandemic times, we should be happy with what we have on hand. So today I have four sections which I want to talk to you about, and hopefully we will spend about 15, 20 minutes on each one of them. The first one is about India's credit rating. I'll discuss why we are talking about it now, and then we are going to talk about Howard's book. The the thing is that a lot of people, including famed Warren Buffett, have a fan in Howard Marks. Howard Marks, who is the CEO of Oaktree Capital Investments, the company that specializes in distressed assets. They've done quite a bit. His newsletters are extremely popular. What he sends out to his investors every month. In fact, Warren Buffett has claimed that, if there is a mail from Howard Marks, I will open and read it. I suggest that you go and take a look at Oaktree Capital to get a sense of what he writes. But very, very well written and very, very consistently written investment ideas. I think no one else has written as much about market cycles as Howard Marks might have written. So we will discuss briefly about Howard Marks' book, the most important thing. Yeah. You have to read the book to know what the most important thing is. Okay. I'm not going to talk about that, but we will talk about Howard Marks as one of the authors that should interest anybody in the investment business. Then we will also talk about, we said we will talk about one behavioral idea. We'll talk about the endowment effect. Yeah. Why, what we will value, what we have, and what we will pay for the same thing are two different things. Like, for example, if you decide that you will clean your house. I mean, this is a very bizarre example, but just for you to think about. If you decide that I will deep clean my house, I do not want to call a crew and pay them 3,000 rupees for doing this, I will do it. Me and the family will decide to divide this job and do it. So let's say you went ahead and did it, and in these pandemic times you might feel quite accomplished having done that, and at the back of your mind will also be the satisfaction, though it is a small amount. In today's day and age, you will feel good about having saved the household that 3,000 rupees. Now, suppose you talk about this to a friend, and then the friend says, very nice, it is so good, So if I paid you 3,000, will you and your family come up and clean up my house also? Imagine a question like that. You will be absolutely shocked and angered and bitter and irritated about it, saying that, how can he even say this? How can he say that, we would be willing to, or suppose, assume that your children as a crew are doing it, okay? No, not you. So you won't be that outraged. But very likely that you will not tell them it is 3,000 rupees. You will say, my children will do it as a Sunday, a weekend activity, but they will charge 5,000 for it or something like that. So the value you will put to the same thing that you have to do, if it's not, so the whole idea of endowment, what you own, how you will value what you own. You will hold a stock which has appreciated from 10 rupees to 100, but you may not buy the same stock at 100 in the market. You'll still value it at 100. You are not a seller at any price less than 100 rupees, but you will not buy it at that price. So there is a difference. So we'll talk about endowment effect. And lastly, we will talk about rebalancing and revising the portfolio, the challenges that are there when you try to do it. So these are the 4 things that we are planning to talk. We can take brief breaks to look at questions that have come in. If any one of you can, if Sangeeta or Ronald or anyone else who is moderating the session, if you see any important questions that are coming up, I will pick those questions up and answer them. Okay. Now on to the first topic, which is the credit rating. Now, India's sovereign credit rating, or the credit rating that is offered for India as an investment destination in the Committee of the World, is at about Ba33, which is like we are as investment grade rating, but we are at the lowest rank of that rating. So from AAA, AA, single A onwards, going all the way down. So if you looked at, there is a rating called BAAA. That is where our rating is, BA3. Now, BA3 is considered speculative, even within the investment grade ratings. Okay. So this has been there for quite some time. There have been instances when, like, for example, after the Pokhran blast and when there were sanctions imposed on us for the testing at Pokhran, there was a revision, downward revision of the rating. Or agencies will say that, we are placing you with, like they said after the pandemic, they said, we'll keep the ratings, but the outlook is negative, which means that we might downgrade you further. Now, that's like the last perch, in the investment grade rating. So if there is a downgrade, we will get into the speculative grading. Now, there are 3 problems with this number. Okay, 3 reasons why this number should affect us. The first one is that it is the cost at which it determines the cost at which we raise money internationally. Right? We are at a time where the economy requires investments, where we require the money, and we need to be, we always have been capital starved. We typically raise money domestically, but given the way things are happening, given the scales at which we are planning to do infrastructure spending and all of that, very important to ask what's the rate at which we will be able to step out and borrow in the markets. A lower rating means we end up paying a much higher credit spread. Our debt is very expensive if our rating is low. Yeah. So it does hurt our ability to raise foreign capital. Second, many of the foreign portfolio investors and foreign institutional investors who come to India, many of them will look at allocation to India or participation in India from the glass of the rating. For example, if we slipped, for instance, even today, if we are in that speculative component within the investment grade rating, you know that there is a set of ratings up to BBB, for example, which is considered investment grade. For example, the provident funds in India cannot invest in debt which is not investment grade. Okay, so anything below that, which is C or CC or D, we can't invest in those because these are considered speculative, or the probability of default is higher. Now, If India slips from there, then many pension funds, many sovereign funds, many other institutional investors, India will become an ineligible destination. So we will not be able to receive those monies either as foreign portfolio investments or as foreign direct investments. So it will become increasingly difficult for us to, so we'll become ineligible directly. You know, that many of these institutions will not be able to allocate any money to India. So it hurts the flows. And the third thing is, if the country's rating is bad, is lower, and the spreads are higher, it also will have a direct impact on several businesses which otherwise have great balance sheets. For example, the classic example is the oil PSUs. We all know very well that oil PSUs tend to have strong balance sheets. They are outperformers. They have fairly strong business exposure. They also have a huge global presence. Now, what will happen is when India's credit rating is affected, it needlessly immediately impacts these high value borrowers, which are government owned, because they directly get affected by the rating. So even if they are AAA rated by virtue of their business balance sheet, a modification in the country's credit rating will lead to an obvious downgrade into their ratings, which makes it expensive for some of these businesses. I mean, many of these businesses have to raise dollar debt, right? So they find it difficult to, it becomes expensive for them to raise debt when the country's rating is changed. So we do care about the rating for India from these points of view. But what the reason why I chose to speak about it today is because I mean, we know that the economic survey this time was a very interesting document, and there were a lot of interesting things to read there. The thing is that for the first time in my memory, the economic survey document moved away from what the government's policy, what the government's view towards various sectors of the economy should be, to devoting an entire chapter to why India's credit rating does not reflect its fundamentals. An entire chapter 3 of the economic survey is devoted to this idea. Not only that, not only does it make an argument and make a case, the extreme detail to which they have gone in terms of research, in terms of comparisons, they've created a cohort set of about 35 countries and made a series of pictures to show that India's credit rating is unreasonably low. And they've also made a representation to international bodies to be able to consider that these ratings should be revised. Okay. So what I will do is I will take a few minutes to show. You can later go and see the economic survey and read through this chapter. It is a 37-page long chapter. It's going to be an effort to kind of plot through it. But what I'm going to do is I will share screen at this time and I will show you some of those pictures. It's fairly interesting. Can I request that my screen share is enabled?
Hello.
Yeah. Can you enable screen share for me?
Yeah, you can do it.
It says disabled at this time.
Just check, ma'am.
It says host disabled, participant screen sharing. So change my status from participant to speaker, right?
Now I've done it now.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So
Welcome, ma'am.
just a second. All right. Now, this is the chapter, does India's sovereign credit rating reflects its fundamental? No. So this is the third chapter in the economic survey, and it makes the case. It makes the case fairly strongly. I'll show you some pictures and then I'll tell you what it is. Now, the first argument it makes is what it sees as bias. Now, if you see this picture shows like India recently became the world's fifth largest economy. So if you looked at the size of economies, India is the fifth largest. Now, the fifth largest economies have always been here. High credit rating, AAA, okay? Now, China enters here. China's rating is right now at A, okay? China is rated single A. So the moment China has entered, this number has dropped, okay? Look at what's happened to after India has entered the top 5 economies. So the first case that the paper is making is that, look, I'm the fifth largest economy. And by virtue of my size, the fact that I'm the fifth largest means that amongst all the countries that you're looking at, I'm performing at a particular level. So you can't have my rating by virtue of being the fifth largest. I should be enjoying a higher rate because my size is an indication that I'm doing well, that it is like saying that you're a blue chip company, but like how we say, you're a blue chip company. So most blue chip companies which are large and leaders in their business, would be rated AAA. So I can't be called as among the blue chips of the world's economy, standing fifth in that line, and have a credit rating which is BA3, which is like speculative credit rating. That's the point this picture makes. It also looks at India's position in purchase power, current international dollars, purchasing power parity is another way that you will measure. In purchasing power parity terms, if you see, India is the third largest economy in the world. And we've been the third largest economy in purchasing power parity for the longest time, and we are still at BA3 kind of a rating, So they're saying that there is really no connection between India's growth, economic growth that has happened, and the size that India has acquired today, and the kind of rating that India is being given. So they say that they openly say that there does seems to be a bias against developing countries. The developed nations have a bias against developed countries and continue to classify them as risky while the fundamentals are actually good. Now, if you were to look at India's credit rating, for example, credit rating history, you can see this. Yeah. You can see that India got downgraded when we did the Pokhran experiment. The black lines show that India's ratings have come down. Now, these are the downgrades that happened. I told you that after the Pokhran experiment, we suffered a downgrade. But subsequently also, you can see that the ratings have, wherever the ratings have been upgraded, the rating upgrade has just gone from BA2 to BA1, all right? And a B to a BB plus, which means that it is just a marginal kind of changes to the rating, but the rating has largely remained in the lowest brackets of the investment rating. So for the longest time, so if you're looking at the data from 98, you're looking at almost 22 years of data, and 22 years of data shows India to be in that range only. So if we were to go further, yeah, so this is what I was talking about. You have a AAA rating, and then you keep coming down, and you say that you can pay adequately, so you're somewhere here. Okay, that's where we have been. Now, what it says is that, they continue to say that our prospects are good and our external positions are good, but our ratings have remained lower and their ratings don't reflect it. I'll just skip this. I'll take you to the case they're making in terms of India's growth rates. They're saying that if you were to look at the growth rates, international growth rates that are being published, for the longest time, growth rates for developed countries, growth rate for developing countries, these two were published as, that's how World Bank published the world GDP numbers, the developed country numbers and the emerging economy numbers. In the past 15 years, that has changed to include a new category. You will say developed economies, developing economies or emerging economies, including India and China, And you will say emerging economies excluding India and China, because India and China consistently posted high GDP growth rates, that they bias the entire emerging market, and given their size, they pushed the entire emerging economy growth rates higher by virtue of their performance. So while the current performance of India's GDP is a matter of concern, we have a negative growth for after a long time, but the projections are for this number to become better as we go along. So speculative grade rating for India has persisted along with a higher GDP growth rate, which is bizarre. It hasn't, so there are several countries whose ratings are better despite their, for example, with the AAA rating, many European countries have GDP growth rates which are at 0.5%, 1%, 2%. So they're saying that you classifying these the country as a risky asset without basis, because it's not a flash in the pan GDP growth rate. There has been a consistently higher rate of GDP growth for India. Okay, now there is this. This is the this does these reflect the fundamentals when we talk about. There's also a qualitative argument that they've put in. Now India has gone and made this representation in G20 as well, where the qualitative concern that they have expressed is that credit rating agencies as a group tended to be pro-cyclical. Now, what is pro-cyclical? It means that if things are good, they tend to continue to keep that rating, and if things go bad, they become absolutely, conservative, in a sense that the behavior is bullish in a bull market and bearish in a bear market. That's what we call as a pro-cyclicality. And the paper points to several instances, like, for example, the East Asian crisis of 97. All these countries were rated very high, and then the crisis came, and then they were all downgraded, and then the upgrade never happened until protests were there, and after a substantial amount of change had happened in the economy. So they say that the credit rating agencies themselves seem to have a bias. Now, this is a fairly serious allegation, and enough evidence has been presented to say that there is a bias. They say that there is a subjectivity in credit ratings, particularly with respect to countries with lower ratings. So countries with lower ratings continue to remain low rated because credit rating agencies do not consider data to upgrade them. So they provided data there. Now, the last part which I want to talk to you about is this cohort research that they've done, which has provided extremely interesting results. So what the economic survey does is that cohort means, people who are in the same, your same league, okay, similar, okay. So you have taken a cohort of about 33 countries. So you've created a sample of 33 countries, okay. And these 33 countries have ratings which are between A+ and Ba3. So these are not, you've excluded the AAA and AA countries. And what you've done is you've just clubbed the ratings, and the ratings are from a scale of 0 to 7 on the graph. So if you see a country with the rating at a 0, it is a Ba3 rating. And if you see a country with rating of 7, it is a A+ country. Okay. And what they've done is they've looked at various data, and that is where it gets very interesting to point out the bias towards India. For example, if you looked at this graph shows the GDP growth and the rating. All right. So these are all these dots represents countries with higher GDP growth. So you will find India with the 6.5 somewhere here. Now, this is GDP growth, and this is the rating. All right. The line shows a general trend. Now, it's very obvious that countries with higher GDP growth will enjoy a higher credit rating. This is lower. This one is Ba3. This one is A. Okay. Now, there are countries, all of these represent, all of this still here, all of this represents countries with much higher GDP growth, but much lower GDP growth, but much higher credit rating. See where India is. So your GDP is much higher than all the other 33 countries, whose GDP is higher. There's only one country whose GDP is higher. Yeah. This is China. China's GDP is higher and China has a rating of A. So that's where China is sitting. So this is where China is. And look at all the other countries. They all have growth rates. Now this one is comparable to India and its rating is A. Now this one's comparable to India. Its rating is still better than India. So there is absolutely nobody here with this kind of GDP and this kind of lower rating. Now, the same thing is true if you looked at inflation. India's inflation numbers are higher compared to the others. So if there are countries with the lower inflation rate, their ratings will be higher. That's why this line is going down. But you do find that the ratings of countries with similar inflation performance, our inflation performance hasn't been too great, right? We have always struggled with higher inflation just as growth picks up, right? But you will still see that India is an outlier. So they have produced several such data. This is government debt. How much is the government debt? Because the credit rating is about borrowing capability. So even in the latest, what do you say, outlook after the budget, the rating agencies have said that, because India is going to make these investments in infrastructure and there is a certain growth orientation, there is hope that the Indian economy will revive and the growth rates will come back. However, India's government debt as a percentage of GDP has increased significantly. It used to be about 60%. If you continue to continue to increase borrowing like how they have done so far, then you will have a situation where the debt will be about 80 to 90% of the GDP. So the GDP numbers becoming better is one of the ways in which our borrowings will become much better, or borrowings as a percentage of GDP will become less. So borrowing as percentage of GDP, look at the credit rating. Borrowing as a percentage of GDP, look at the credit rate. So we're not a severely borrowing country, or we are not a country with a huge amount of debt. Subsequently, the paper also makes a case for how the reserves that we have we have a forex reserves of 580 billion. This is more than enough to pay not only the government's debt, but also the private sector's international debt. So there is really no worry of default. So it shows, this is again rating with respect to current account balances. This is rating with respect to investor protection. So there are so many, then there is political stability, then there is government effectiveness, levels of corruption. So, you can see control of corruption, rule of law. Everywhere you will find that India is doing positively, but tends to have a much lower. So that is really where really what the paper says. And it also, I will leave you to go and see these various cases that have been made, pictures that have been made. Okay, but they've also done a stress test which points out, how India has enough, how much of reserves do we have, and are these reserves, because you're in rating, you're looking at the possibility of default. And what they are saying is that India will be able to, if you see the stress test, India is much better off than most of the countries in that cohort. We are at triple B rating, and we have absolutely completely covering all the outstandings with the amount of debt. Okay, so I will leave that here. And what kind of it's interesting. It's an interesting page to see, and you can go back and see those arguments that are there. Yeah, I've stopped share at this time. Ronald, is my stop share has happened, right? You're able to, what is the display right now? I'm not able to.
Ma'am, I can see you now.
Okay, the display. All right. So it's an interesting study which looks at India's rating and makes this case. Now, if India's rating were to go up, I'm not saying that these efforts are going to immediately create good results, because the GDP numbers will have to fall in place. But it's an event too. I'm very excited about this because I think it's an event to look forward to. Now, having gone out in the world and made this case saying that, look, our fundamentals are much stronger. We have lower levels of inflation, lower levels of high levels of government effectiveness, lower levels of corruption compared to many other countries. We are among the top 5 economies in terms of size, and therefore our rating of Ba3 is not reflective of our fundamentals. That's the case the government has made, and the government has made this case with adequate amount of data comparison, and very much established the bias in the way in which India is looked at. Now, if this is going to result in a better credit rating for India, it will be a very bullish event because of the same 3 reasons that I pointed out to you. One, the government's ability. Government doesn't borrow internationally as much. It borrows primarily domestically to meet its deficits. But the ability of the government to borrow internationally will go up. I mean, that will lead to a certain set of external sector reforms which are much overdue for a country of our size and our performance. We still do not have the currency being convertible on the capital account. If there is a confidence about capital flows into India, that conversion might happen. That will be a big step if that were to happen. Yeah. So our currency will become convertible on the capital account. If the currency becomes convertible on capital account, and if the government begins to tap international borrowings at a bigger rate, that's a big picture. That will modify the contours of the economy significantly. Yeah, if that were to happen. That's like the big picture, big effect, big bang effect. But at a much more reasonable levels, if there are 2 things that get achieved. One, the presence of better ratings increases the amount of foreign direct investments. See, the concerns that credit rating agencies have said about India are only 3. Okay, the first one is the lower GDP numbers that we are looking at. 2 is the higher level of government borrowing as a percentage of GDP, and 3 is the distressed assets in the banking sector. Now, we do know that there are several specialist agencies, investors abroad, who are looking at distressed assets in India and trying to make an investment case for these distressed assets and for a way to turn them around. So, if we are able to position this as an investment proposition and are able to have a better rating backing us as a country, large number of institutions that invest in such assets would begin to look at India. So that will be a positive thing. So the kind of portfolio flows, the kind of FII, FDI participation India will get will become better. And of course, third and the most obvious thing is that better credit rating will mean that our banks, our private sector companies can raise international debt at much lower cost. We have several businesses, several oil businesses, commodity businesses, financial sector businesses, as well as even smaller businesses like gem, jewelry, tourism, and then our biggest international showpiece, IT, which all have international capital requirements that they have met through fairly stringent choices. And sometimes IT, for example, doesn't borrow. I mean, primarily raises money through equity. We know that equity is an expensive route to raising capital. So you do know that, but IT as a business is not leveraged. I mean, that's a different topic. But if you were to look at even the commodity businesses, even the metals, the oils, and all of those, which are to a large extent driven by events, global events, it would be a great benefit to these businesses if their borrowing costs can come down. So I thought that this is a interesting topic to discuss, to look at, and to say that if these ratings begin to reflect our fundamental strengths, then probably it is a good event for the market. Whether rating changes impact the Sensex. Okay, the results there are mixed, but most of the time, given the kind of sensitivity to FII flows, okay, any global designation of India, which leads us to getting a higher allocation in international institutional portfolio, has resulted in flows going up, which is a positive for markets. Okay, so that is end of section 1. We've spent about a considerable amount of time on this, I would believe. Okay, now let me move on to quickly move on to the next two things and then go to your rebalancing and revisioning, which you have the greatest interest in. I did tell you about Howard Marks and Howard Marks's books and how interesting his writing is. Just to give you an example, I will talk about his newsletters are widely followed. His latest newsletter talks about how value and growth, have remained almost like two political parties. Okay, I will buy only if the price is right, and I will buy only if with a target upside, and book those profits. And that's going to be my approach to investing, is what a value investor would say. A growth investor would say that I will buy even if price is high, because I believe that the prices have not still considered the possibility of exponential growth. Good things do not come cheap, and identifying growth potential for above average growth in revenue and earnings, and staying with such investment proposition for a longer time without booking out, is what is going to give benefits to my portfolio. So you have a growth story and you have a value story. And what Howard points out in his current newsletter is that we've for the longest time considered these as two separate ideas, and thought of them as opposing ideas. So he's actually making the case that there might be a case for looking at them together. And there he very interestingly points out how Warren Buffett's earlier position that he will not invest in IT at all, or he did not like growth businesses at all. Charlie Munger had spoken to him, convinced him about the possibilities of doing this, and how this business has benefited from its investment in Apple, for example, and how there are positions in technology businesses today. Technology represents the classic growth case where it almost never comes cheap. Okay, and several international investors have made a huge amount of money by the bets that they've made in technology, and the highest steep losses in terms of wrong choices have also come in technology. So uh, Howard has this wisdom and perspective. He's been in the business for a long time. He's a senior guy, 1946 born. So what you do realize is that he's pointing out to this very interesting amalgam that's happening between growth and value in a certain way, that with probably a growth bias, if you will, in which he says that winning businesses today have a certain bold, audacious view of the world, and the way in which they put themselves out into coming into bigger league is different. And I think in India, we have always believed in the growth story, right? Much more, because we have had so many instances of small businesses becoming larger. So for those of us there are at least three things that are very remarkable about Howard's writings. One is being able to question some of these long held ideas. He brings about a fresh perspective. The second thing is his writing on market cycles is extremely good. The ability to, so we were talking about asset allocation, we're talking about how asset allocation is a value adding proposition for the advisor. Now, if you want to sharpen that skill of being able to let your investors know where their money should be, a sound understanding of macroeconomic cycles is extremely valuable to do that, and to develop that kind of orientation towards what am I looking for cycles. Wood Marks also has a book called Market Cycles, so you should try that too. So if you were able to develop that cyclicality, so fresh perspectives, cyclicality, Third and the most important thing, which is the most important thing in the book, you still figure it out, which is in terms of customization. How there can be enough opportunities in the market, but your work with the focus on your portfolio or your client's portfolio and your be risks and returns in the market, but ultimately your skill in being able to develop, construct the portfolio that matters to your client um, is what is going to make a difference. Being able to align your investment to your needs. And he says that do not dismiss it off as a simple idea. The thing is that you don't, for example, I mean, we discussed that in one of the earlier sessions. Now, if an investor has a house and the investor is paying a EMI, a home loan on it, okay. Now, there is a fairly good possibility that the salary will continue and the ability to pay the EMI will continue to persist during the life of the loan. Let's say it's a 15-year loan. What we do see as a phenomenon across the world, not just in India, across the world, is that investors tend to prepay the housing loan. They do it because they believe that the house that they are living in should be theirs. And they see that as the best risk buffer. Best risk buffer because if there was something to happen, if there was a risk to my job, if there is a risk to my income, if there is a event that I cannot foresee, the idea of having a place to live in represents somewhere I can stand, somewhere I can be, okay, even if I didn't have a job, and think of my alternatives. This whole bizarre idea of coming to the streets, or the fear of not being able to pay rents if you did not have a salary. These weigh very heavily on people's heads, that the house that they live in, they would prefer to have it debt free. People tend to prepay. So from a financial angle, you will say that, look, the cost of the loan might be much smaller, so your money can be put to better uses. But from a investor's thinking perspective, this might seem like an important thing. Howard Marks brings up instances of this kind where some financial decisions will have to be taken because of the preference and need of the investor. That is more important than the markets, the cycles, the risks, and the return. So to an advisor, it's a fairly useful book to read, and I wanted to recommend it as one of the books that you might want to consider. Now, having spoken about that, I think I will change the order and shift and bring about rebalancing and revision of the portfolio up. Spend the next 10 minutes or so to talk about it, and then move on to endowment effect. But at this point, I wanted to ask: are there any questions? Are there any specific things that you would like me to invest to talk about?
No, there are no questions, Uma, for the time being.
No questions at this time. All right. So if I were to move on and talk about portfolio revision and rebalancing, the biggest challenge in portfolio revision and rebalancing is that, let's say, you want to revise, you have constructed a conservative portfolio which has only 30% of its exposure to equity. You have a conservative portfolio of this choice. Persuading this investor to increase this allocation, okay, to make a revision and increase this allocation is difficult. On the other hand, you have an aggressive portfolio which has 60% in equity. Equity markets are doing very well. So this allocation of 60 has moved up to 70. To rebalance would mean that bringing the equity component down. Now, what the investor will protest is that you're booking me out of a performing asset and you're increasing my investment in a non-performing asset. The situation we find ourselves in today. Investors know that the return from debt investments are lower, and to be able to tell the investor that you should book money out of the equity market and put it in debt seems like an idea where the portfolio's run rate is deliberately slowed down. Okay, that is the big challenge in revisioning and rebalancing. Why would you want to take money out of a winning asset and put it into a losing asset? Because there is a proportion that will have to be maintained. Now, if this question is not addressed right at the start, subsequent action will become difficult. Because at every point, see, there is always this temptation to behave as if we know where the market is going. Yeah, that's a big challenge. If we all knew where the market were going, we will all be superb investors, right? But we only know with the benefit of hindsight. So the temptation is always there. Oh, the market is still running. Okay. So if you are able to have that conversation right ahead in terms of saying that we actually do not know where the markets would go, and we commit to a certain asset allocation because we believe that this asset allocation is going to help your financial goals, it's going to help your risk profiles. Okay. Now, if these conversations have not been convincingly done right at the start, subsequent rebalancing and revisioning is going to be difficult. When we rebalance the portfolio, we need to be able to go back to the risk-taking capabilities. For example, if we say that my position today is 70% in equity, the extent of impact on the portfolio for, say, a 10% correction is going to be much stronger. Again, 60 basis points, I'm going to have a 70 basis point impact. So it's going to pull my portfolio back much more than what would have been the case if it were at 60. So being able to go back to that risk idea and the buffering idea is one of the ways to enable a rebalancing of the portfolio. And while we are rebalancing, if you believe that a certain tactical mid-path can be looked at, okay, so instead of bringing the portfolio drastically down from 70 to 60, if we are able to say, I mean, investors understand the language of profit booking much better than the idea of rebalancing. Both are the same. So if you're booking your profit on the equity portfolio, what you're doing is you're rebalancing the portfolio. You're taking some of the money that is in equity and putting it into liquid assets or debt assets, right? So if you're able to look at periodically taking the money out and putting it in, and if you're able to implement it in a gradual manner, investors are more likely to see it as something which is beneficial to them. And there is also the other angle of leaving what we call as the tactical balance. So instead of going, like, let's say from 60, the portfolio has gone to 70, you're booking 5%. That 65, that 5 overweight which is remaining is your tactical overweight to equity, given the fact that equity is doing well. So it's a kind of a 50-50 solution. Investors tend to, the reason why you would want to advocate it is for purely from a risk perspective, purely from the point of view of the investor not having too much of downside should the market correct. Now the question also is this, like, let's say that you booked this profit out and the portfolio continues to run. The markets continue to perform well. Then the investor is likely to go back and ask, oh, if this money had also been in the market, it would have also run much faster. I would have met my goals much earlier. And by virtue of pulling this money out of the market, you kind of reduced my run rate or impacted the return that is there on the portfolio. It would have all been good. It would have all been good. Now, this kind of an attitude represents the mismatch between what kind of risks the investor wants to take and what kind of exposure the investor has to equity. Many times you will find that inadequate equity exposure leads to this kind of reactions. So it's always a good idea to keep going back to asking, particularly investors with regular surpluses. We have this problem across the board. Investors have adequate amount of income. Investors have adequate amount of surpluses in their portfolio. They have much lower level of credit risks. They have a good credit score, financially sound, but tend to be underinvested in equity. So you have a situation where the investor's exposure to equity or investors' exposure to risky assets is much lower from the point of view of willingness. Okay, we always talk about ability and willingness. The investor, because of the strong financial position, is able to invest in equity, but is unwilling to invest because of what he sees as persistent risks. So tuning, so when we say revisioning of the portfolio, tuning the portfolio to a known financial position of the investor helps immensely in rebalancing and revisioning. The last point I want to make there is that do not see revisioning and rebalancing as drastic. If you look at large institutional investors and their asset allocation policies, whether it is tactical, even where they have a tactical changes in assets from the point of view of delivering value, as we discussed in one of the earlier sessions, these changes are not dramatic. So you don't move equity from 50 to 70, from 70 to 40. We don't do those things, right? The changes are usually marginal. They are within a 5% range, because that is the kind of range that does not create shocks in the portfolio. So do not make dramatic, drastic changes in the investor's portfolio. So the summary of points here is to say that the investor can start with a particular position, but as you work with the investor, you realize that the kind of ability to bear risks may be different, or the willingness to bear risks may be different. So it's only with the time that you're able to actually arrive at the ideal portfolio allocation for the investor. So do not hold the original allocation as fast and final, but allow for investors' experience to guide how that allocation might have to be. And investors who are reluctant equity investors, even after some time, you'll find that with experiences in the market and with the ability to kind of see growth, they will tend to modify allocation. So allow for investor experience with the returns and risk to guide where the portfolio's allocations will have to be there first. Second, bringing the investor to the ideal portfolio allocation that suits their temperament as well as their financial goals is a process. It takes time. So it has to be done over a period of time, and it has to be done gradually. Dramatically altering the portfolio can create risks for you because no one can forecast the market. And third, while we talk of the portfolio being aligned to the investor, aligned to the investor's risks, and aligned to the investor's returns, it's important to be able to talk the language the investor understands, language like the profit booking rather than rebalancing. Look at both these terms. Profit booking is something that investors know, have heard and known, but rebalancing seems like out of the textbook and the university. So be able to introduce discipline into that process that is in alignment with what you think is going to manage the risk better is a better approach than trying to, let the portfolio run and take on the risks for the investor. Now to the last, are there any questions here, Sangeeta?
No, there are no questions.
All right. Okay, so we'll get into the last segment for today. You've been with me for the longest time. I'll not take too much time. The idea of the endowment effect. So you meet a friend who has just purchased a house, and the house is on the 14th floor, the top floor of a large building. And then when you get to the house in summer, you say that, oh my God, you brought the top floor. It's like really warm, the heat is just on the terrace. The friend will say, look at the views, what a beautiful view, what amount of wind, and, it is nice. So you meet a friend who's bought a house in a second floor, okay? And you go in and say that, oh, the house is beautiful, but doesn't it seem a little dark? So that guy will say, it is absolutely cool and nice in summer. So that's endowment effect for you. What we own. So the top floor guy will believe that the view is better than the heat. The bottom floor guy will believe that the cool interiors are much better than losing fine views and vistas from his window. Because both of them are house owners and they believe that the house they own represents the best case. So the moment you own something, you tend to value it much more than what you have not owned, or the whole idea of opportunity cost. So if you're holding a stock, as I said, and if the stock has appreciated, you will continue to believe that it is very valuable. Yeah. So you will say that I won't sell this for anything less than 100 rupees. But if you have to buy, I will only pay 80 rupees. So both cannot be true, right? If you're a new buyer at 80, then the value of the stock is 80, right? If the value of the stock is 100, then at that price, you should be willing to buy more. So we call this as the endowment effect in behavioral finance, where we will overvalue what is ours. We will tend to think that what we are already owning is much more precious, much more important, and not be willing to part with it, not be willing to undervalue it in any manner, and not be willing to, and we will also be unwilling to evaluate another opportunity sensibly. This has been discussed in behavioral finance in a great detail. And the influence on our behavior is that our willingness to pay is very, very different because we see that as a separate decision. We do not see it as, so if you say that I have a stock which I believe is worth so much, then I will not pay for that stock because I see these as two different investment decisions. Many times, adding on to the portfolio, the same investor would have purchased at an IPO or an NFO, and making a subsequent investment when the prices are higher or when the NAV has moved up becomes difficult for the investor. They will be very proud of saying, oh, I was an NFO investor, my investment has appreciated. So if your investment has appreciated and done so well, then you should be willing to do more of it. But that decision becomes very difficult for the investor because buying more seems like a costly exercise for the investor. So it's very important to be able to look at this behavioral limitation of the investor and understand that framing. This is called the endowment effect, quite widely prevalent, where we are very proud of what we have already. To be able to keep this in mind, that investors will come with this limitation. I think I've run out of time. It's like it's 7:40 already. You've been with me for more than an hour. So I will pause at this point. I think broadly, these were the ideas I wanted to discuss with you today. And I'll go back to Sangeeta and Rupa for questions or any other discussions that they would want to have. Thank you so much. Over to you, Sangeeta.
Thank you so much, Uma. One question, this is nothing to do about rebalancing, but this is something which generally happens when you are looking at a client's portfolio, that obviously amongst 10 schemes that you give into the customer over a period of time, and one of them is underperforming very badly. So what happens is, under the pretext of rebalancing, you want to redeem that. Now, and of course, you tend to invest into a fund which is a performing fund. But obviously, one fund cannot be doing well on a continuous basis. Now, what would you like to say about it?
See, you have to do it. We call this as using demonstration effect. Initially, the investor will not sell to book the losses. So you have to create an imaginary portfolio saying that this is what I'm asking you to do. So let's track these two things. Suppose you implement my idea and took your money out of portfolio fund A and put it in fund B. So you have subsequent conversations where you will continue to show the investors both. Look, your fund A investment is still bleeding. If you had listened to me and done fund B, this is what you would have done. Okay. So if you're able to consistently show, this is what we say, the opportunity cost. If you're able to show that will want to participate in that because you've already started showcasing it and framing it. Okay. So this was my advice, which you did not implement, but it would have resulted in this. Okay. Then the investor will be tempted to make that change because the investor will see that gain. Otherwise, it's difficult for the investor to see that gain.
Another question I had is that it is not necessary that somebody wants to generally do rebalancing, But there are some chartered accountants who are generally the accountant type of people. They want to do some booking of profit at the end of every year. Do you think it's a good practice to do that?
See, if it makes sense from a tax angle, maybe, but otherwise, typically what we say is that unless these ratios are too wavered, it's okay for some of these to persist. Some small changes, it doesn't have to be cut and right, 60, 30, 10 kind of a thing, If 60 is lying at 62 or 63, it's all right. And plus, we also have this ability to work with fresh surpluses. See, the investor is generating a surplus every year from his savings anyway. So when you make an investment decision of that, you're modifying the portfolio's composition in any case. Sometimes investors may have other flows coming from sale of other assets or inheritances or bonuses or selling of ESOPs. You see, investors can have events in their life that leads to certain lump sum amounts of money that still provides you the opportunity to reorient the portfolio. You don't have to book the profits. Don't book profits for the sake of booking profits is what I would say.
Okay.
All
I'll
right.
just see if there's. I think everybody seems to be quite bold by what you have said, so there are no questions.
Oh my God. All right. So please do go and read that credit rating document that has been put. I think it's a good case that has been made. And do Google endowment effect to read so many of the stories. And Oak Tree Capital's monthly newsletters are all available online. So please go and see what Marx has got to say. It might help. Thank you so much for being with me
Thank you
today.
so
I
much.
think
Thank you,
that's, yeah.
Uma. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye bye.